Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Father.
Just to say thank you for inviting me, to this worship service, this community worship, and to give this brief, I don't know if I should say it's brief reflection. Thank you for, considering me to be in your midst today. And thanks to Jen for saying those wonderful things about me. I told her when she came back to her seat that I will write her a check for, for saying something good about me, first time in her life since I've known her. So, Jen, get your check after here. Well, our reflection today is centered on, that connection between Job and Jesus. And, going through the Old Testament, we see some figures, some historical figures and some biblical figures that have direct link with the personality of Jesus. And there is something we can always learn, either it is Abraham or Moses or Joshua or Jonah or even Isaac, they have some, correlation. But before I go into that, something happened last weekend. As you can tell, during my homily last Sunday, I was invited to preach, a retreat at a parish, for Black History Month, and I just used that as an opportunity to talk to our students here, since many of them may not know about Black History Month or what goes on in the Black History Month. And it's no fault of theirs, but sometimes it's good to learn, just as I also like to learn when I talk to the students, where they come from, where their parents come from, or their grandparents, and all of these histories. And you come to realize that, almost everyone who came to this country, talking about our ancestors, some of them did not find it easy, coming into this country. Either they are Catholics or Protestants or Native Americans or Hispanics, or the Italian Catholics or the Irish Catholics, and so on and so forth. But just that, the blacks came here as slaves and were not treated well at all, for very many obvious reasons. And I told the students at Mass that the Catholic Church did not play a good role either. I wanted them to know in what ways the Catholic Church would have contributed, to making things, more terrible for the blacks, and how that still affects a lot of black people in this age and time. So collectively, I wanted us to review our ugly past, because we have it and we have to own it. And so many other people are doing that. The Jesuits, in Georgetown University are paying back some reparation, just to acknowledge the fact that they did not do well. When you don't do well, acknowledge it. It may not be you, but even people before you. I made reference to what happened in Canada, how the Native Americans, the Canadians, the natives were treated, by the Catholic Church, and how they messed up big time, and the Pope had to go on wheelchair to go make an apology on behalf of the church. Just going through all of this and, telling them about Black History Month, The one that shocked most of them, because I got some feedbacks, was the fact that the first black Catholic priest in the United States was not accepted by any seminary in the US. He had to be sent to Rome because of the color of his skin. No seminary accepted him. He spent 6 whole years or 7 in Rome, got ordained in Rome, came back to the United States. So tell me how you couldn't be trained in America, but then you had to come and minister to folks in America. How tough would that be? But these are people that paved way for what we have today going on. And he really, really suffered, Father Augustine Tolton. Right now, he's in the process of being canonized, as a saint, and that's a whole lot of process in the Catholic Church. I'm thinking about the way he died. He died at 42, the way he was treated by fellow priests and bishop. And I also told them about Sister Tia Bowman. Sister Tia Bowman, the ministry in Greensboro is named after her. And she was a nun in Wisconsin just in the 50s, and her parents kicked against her joining. She was an only child. Her parents were not even Catholics. She converted to Catholicism at the age of 9. And then by the time she was 16, she said she wanted to be a nun. And she wanted to join this congregation that was all white, no black. The parents said no. They fought. She went, protested by not eating for several days. And then finally they allowed her. She got into the congregation. She did not find life easy. She was the only black nun. They would avoid her. If she sits on a chair, all other sisters would avoid the whole of that area. They made fun of her because of her hair and all of this. So the reason why I'm saying all of this is these people went through all of these things, and despite going through these things, they held on to their faith. Because I'm going to connect it eventually to Job. Look at the story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Even as we talk about the end of the Black History Month, I told them how, one of the speeches he gave, the I Have a Dream, speech, it's very popular. That was in 1963. But the second one that is also very popular is the one he says, I have been on the mountaintop. Though I may not get there, but collectively as a people, we'll get there someday. And that was very prophetic because that was the night before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. So talking about all of these people, we see how suffering was necessarily, a part of their existence. Suffering. So when we think of Job, and we think of ourselves, because I'm sure some of us are going through some similar things, though it may not be like Job, but we also have some little Jobs in this room. We need things that we handle every now and again. So there was a poem titled Footprints in the Sand by Caroline Joyce Carty. It's about a man who in his dream was walking by the beach with the Lord. For each scene, he noticed 2 sets of footprints in the sand. When the last scene of his life flashed before him, he noticed that many times along the path of his life, there was only 1 set of footprints. He also noticed that it happened that at the very lowest and saddest times in his life, so he questioned the Lord about it. He said, Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you would walk with me all the way. I don't understand why, when I needed you most, you would leave me. The Lord replied, my son, I love you, and I will never leave you. During your times of trial and suffering, when you see only 1 set of footprints, it was then that I carried you in my arms. My dear friends, our reflection today deals with a fundamental question we all have puzzled over at some time. Namely, if there is a God, why is there suffering and pain? We all have to deal with real suffering in our lives from time to time. One of the hardest questions atheists pose to people of faith is, if God is all-powerful and all-good, why did he create a world where there is suffering? Why can't God create a world without pain if he is all-good and all-powerful? And I hear these questions a lot, even from the young students, that come to talk to me. Sometimes they pray, and it's like nothing is being done. I'm sure you felt that way sometimes too. Harold Kushner in 1981 wrote the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And it was about his 3-year-old son who was suffering from a degenerative, disease that meant that, by the time he became a teenager, he would be looking like as if he was 100 years old. So this was happening right there in his eyes. And Harold Kushner, being a conservative rabbi, very faithful and very dutiful, very committed to his faith, couldn't understand why he would be the one to go through this when bad things happen to good people. Also, C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest Christian writers of modern times, wrote the book, A Grief Observed. And it was about his wife who was diagnosed with cancer and was dying slowly and gradually. And C.S. Lewis, you know, very faithful man and very committed to his faith, couldn't, understand. He didn't have the words to explain why God would allow this to happen. And ironically, the name of the wife was Joy. He said, God, why are you taking my joy away despite worshiping you all my life? We come to that point, some of the times in our lives when we are just broken, we are shattered. What do? Every one of us here, we have experienced it. Job suffered. But in his suffering, we will know that he's probably not alone. I've always struggled with the mystery of the cross. It is a bizarre part of our faith. And of course, most Christian denominations are in the season of Lent, and we know how the cross plays an important role for us as a focal point of reflection during Lent. And the mystery lies in the seeming needlessly of it. How can such a torturous murder give way to our redemption? The cross leads to the crown. Richard Rohr says that struggle and incomprehensible mystery are the way to transformation. If you avoid such tensions, you learn nothing new and become stagnant in your spiritual life. It's almost like saying, no pain, no gain. The way I see the cross and much of the spiritual life is both a blessing and a curse. The cross symbolized the curse of sin and brokenness, yet the action on the cross blessed humanity with healing, redemption, and divine love. The mystery of the cross may never be understood except in the context of the blessing curse paradox. Interestingly, we find this paradox throughout life. There is a story in the Old Testament, talking about Moses in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 4 to 9, when, the Israelites were on their way, journeying through the desert. They've had a lot of challenges, a lot of suffering along that path. And of course, they were beaten by snakes, poisonous snakes. So what did God tell Moses as a remedy? He said, okay, you know what? You are going to fashion, a bronze snake on a stick and raise it up so that anybody beaten by that poisonous snake, all they needed to do was to look up on the one you have made on that tree. And as soon as they looked up on that, they will be healed. It's coming from the Old Testament. And then in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, it says, by his stripes we are healed. So the New Testament understanding of that Old Testament story is that Jesus hangs on the cross, on the tree of life, in that beautiful opening hymn we sang today. That is the tree of life. And then each time you are in sorrow or you are suffering or life is just pushing you all around, all you needed to do was to look up on that tree of life and you will be healed, you will be saved, you will be redeemed. Job and Jesus. It was not without reason, therefore, that the fathers of the church spoke of Job and his sufferings as a type of Christ and his sufferings. Job and Jesus. At the beginning, I was telling you about some of those connections from, the Old Testament and how they could connect to Jesus. Last Sunday, we read the story of Abraham and Isaac, and you would not even believe that, when Abraham got to the foot of the cross, the foot of the mountain, where he was going to, listen to the test God was giving him to go sacrifice Isaac, the only child. Everybody here knows the story of Abraham, right? Okay, just to be sure. If you don't know it, I will tell you, but it will take extra time if I have to say that. Yeah. So they got to the foot of the mountain, and Abraham, said to the servants, just wait here, And he went up with Isaac, and Isaac was made to carry the wood of the sacrifice that was supposed to be used for the sacrifice. It was while they were walking up the mountain that Isaac asked him, so, Dad, I'm aware of sacrifices in our culture, and I know it's usually done with animals. You and I are going to offer this sacrifice. I am carrying the wood meant for the sacrifice, but where is the animal to be used for the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God will provide. Imagine Isaac carrying the wood of his own sacrifice. Imagine Jesus carrying the cross, another wood, another tree of his own sacrifice for humanity. And then think of Joshua in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and how that connects with Jesus in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jeremiah thrown into the cistern suffered so terribly just because of his faith, and how that meant, even when his family and friends disowned him, Jesus suffered the same from even his closest companions, even his closest friends. They disowned him. St. Gregory the Great, for example, says of Job, and therefore it behoved that blessed Job also, who uttered those high mysteries of his incarnation, should by his life be a sign of him, who by voice he proclaimed, and by all that he underwent should shew forth what were to be his sufferings, and should so much the more truly foretell the mysteries of his passion, as he prophesied then, not merely with his lips, but also by suffering. In his innocent suffering, final vindication, and priestly intercession for those who had wronged him, Job showed forth the pattern of the one in whom he believed. In both Job and Jesus, the theologian of the cross sees paragons of how God makes himself known to us. For that reason, Job is also the paradigmatic disciple, as St. James would say. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and how the outcome of the Lord's dealing, that the Lord is full of compassion and merciful. So Job gives us example of endurance and perseverance. Endurance and perseverance, which were also the attributes that, kept many of our ancestors in faith, to be able to go through what life was throwing at them. Job is a model of suffering, not because of a stoic acceptance of pain, but because of his certain hope of final eschatological vindication. He was a man who came to a true knowledge of the purpose of suffering, and found therein true knowledge of God, the God who hides himself in suffering, trial, shame, loneliness, in order to reveal salvation to us. From the life of Job, we can learn a lot about the theology of the cross. How many of us have been through an extremely trying event only to emerge stronger and better on the other side? I'm sure you know the story of Job and all he had to go through. And you know how that happened in the first place, because the devil or Satan went to God and said, you think this guy is faithful to you? It's just because you've blessed him so much. You've given him so much. Let's give him some test and see if he will not deny you or disown you. And that was how that happened. So that was like temptation or test. Would that be test or temptation? So this week last 2 Sundays ago, I started to teach the students about, since we're in the season of Lent, about the difference between to tempt and to test. Because Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. And then who came to test Jesus or to tempt Jesus? It was the devil. So this was like preparing our minds, like if Jesus will be tempted, then we all have to be on, we have to be on our guards, because if Christ, who is God, should be tempted, how about us, ordinary human beings? So because I was, making reference to the Greek translation of the word used in that passage of the Bible, which is presemos. And presemos means to test or to tempt, depending on who was doing the action at the time. If it was God, it is to test. If it was the devil, it is to tempt. If it is to test, it means to bring out the good in you. They bring out positive side of you. That is what God wants to see. But if it is to tempt, then it is the devil. It doesn't want the good side of you. It wants the bad side. It wants you to fall, wants you to fail. So as I was analyzing this, then I gave an example to the students, and I said, like your professors in school, they give you tests every now and again. The reason for the test is for you to bring out the good in you. You remember Jake? Jake was sitting here. Jake, this is during the homily, Catholic Mass. Jake said, "I don't agree with you, Father." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "My professors, I think they tempt us. They want us to fail." I said, "No. Don't you think that's why they call it tests, so that you can prove what you've studied?" He said, "Well, I don't think so." And then last Sunday, the reading was now on Abraham. I now brought out again this whole, dynamic of tests and tempt in the Old Testament. And the word in Hebrew language is nakah, which is also similar to what we find in Greek language. And then I said, you see, it's coming out again in Hebrew, and it means the same way it will mean in the New Testament, either to test or to tempt. Because this was coming from God, it meant to test Abraham's faith so that the good in him can come out. And Jake this time was sitting on this side because he was serving at Mass. And then I looked at Jake, I said, "Did anything change in the past 1 week?" He said, "Not yet." So if there are professors here, please be kind to your students, okay? Yeah, so in all of these journeys, we have been through so many difficult moments. Stephen Curtis Chapman, in his song, Beautiful Scars, sings about the painful stories that make us who we are, and the wounds of Christ that helped heal and set us free. According to Venerable Archbishop Futishin of New York, sometimes the only way the good Lord can get into some hearts is to break them. I tell you, very powerful. Sometimes the only way the good Lord can get into some hearts is to break them. Much of life seems cursed with suffering and sacrifice, which upon struggle and reflection turn out to be blessings that build our identity and help us to face life in new ways. So when we see Job in the Gospels, we discover how we suffer physically, we suffer emotionally, we suffer, psychologically, and even sometimes we have spiritual pains. And in the Gospels, we see so many people who came to Jesus who had all of this, so many things going on with them. Sometimes it was just physical, sometimes leprosy, maybe sometimes they were just sick with fever, or sometimes somebody has died. In all of these variations, we see Christ showing up to them. For example, in Mark chapter 1, verse 29 to 39, we are told the story of Simon's mother-in-law who laid with fever, and Christ is not unmoved. We are told that Jesus approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. Approached, grasped, and helped. Those three words, very powerful. They are not words to be taken lightly. These words reveal the truth of the God whom we serve. God is not unmoved or uncaring towards our pain and our suffering. God cares, and God chooses to be involved in our lives and in our world. We stand always in need of a God who cares. The wound within ourselves is too deep, too much for us to overcome on our own. We need a God who will approach us, who will grasp our hands, and who will heal us and help us up. We have this in Jesus. He alone can make what is broken to become beautiful. He alone can turn your scars into stars. Never underestimate God's power to repair and to restore. Let me conclude by telling you a story you probably must have heard about Horatio Spafford. He was a successful lawyer and a businessman in Chicago. He had a wife, Anna, and 5 children. In 1871, he lost his only son to pneumonia. As he was trying to get over the shock, he lost a great part of his business to a fire outbreak. You probably must have read about that huge fire outbreak in Chicago around 1872, thereabout. 2 years after he lost, his only son, they decided to go on a family trip to Europe. There were no flights, so then they had to go by ship, by boat from Chicago to New York, and then New York to cross the Atlantic. So when they got to New York, he got another emergency. Something else was happening. He had to come back. And then the wife and the 4 daughters continued on that journey. So when he got back to Chicago, some days afterwards, he got a telegram message from the wife, which said, "Saved alone." Saved alone. When he saw that, he knew something was wrong. He started to head back to Europe. And then as he was sailing across the Atlantic, the captain of the ship called him and said, "This is a point where your wife and your 4 daughters perished. But your wife did not die. About 226 people died. But your 4 daughters perished here together with the other passengers." Horatio Spafford became very helpless at that moment. Tears started to roll down his eyes. Remember, lost the only son, lost all his business in that fire disaster, many more terrible things going on afterwards, and now 4 daughters died. Are you thinking of what Job went through in his own time? That was how he composed that song, "It Is Well With My Soul."